Good afternoon. Welcome to what is the 7th session in the Synoikis Digital Classics Spring 2025 semester. This is actually the 6th one that's been broadcast. The 3rd one will be broadcast in a couple of weeks, so slightly out of sequence. But the other 9 are all coming on a weekly basis. So this is session 7. This session is going to be about working with cuneiform texts. And various digital classics and digital humanities approaches to that method. The session is designed that if you're not a cuneiformist or a specialist of any of the languages that write in cuneiform, you will still be able to follow and get a lot out of it. That is indeed specifically how it's designed. So please do stick around, even if that's not your normal specialism. We're very pleased and very privileged to have with us several experts on various different aspects of cuneiform work. We have Seraina Nett from Copenhagen University. We have Rune Rattenborg from Lund University and Katharine from King's College London, who is also the co-organizer of this semester. And we're also joined in spirit by Émilie Pagé-Perron from the University of York, who can't be here to actually present, but who's designed part of the content and material that will be presented today. So welcome to those of you who are watching us live on YouTube now, and welcome also to those who are watching it in the future. If you're watching live, please pop a note in the live chat to let us know that you're there and where you're watching from. Say hi, and also feel free to use the live chat to ask any questions or make any comments throughout the session. And at the end, we'll have a bit of time set aside for discussion and questions. And so we'd be very, very happy to have your questions or input then. But I think we can dive straight in. I think the first part of this, and possibly an overview of the session as a whole, is going to be presented by Seraina. So I'll hand over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, very excited to be here. Welcome everyone who's watching. And I will start by doing an introduction to what we're going to be talking about today, more general, and then also give you a bit of a general introduction into what I mean when we talk about cuneiform text. When are we, where are we, and so forth. So let's dive right in. So Rune and I will take turns a little bit for today's lesson, and Katie will contribute the resources for Hittite. So yeah, I would like to start with an overview of what we actually mean when we talk about cuneiform writing. When are we? Where are we? Which languages are we talking about? Because yeah, we just assumed that most people watching are probably not that familiar with this, and we'll also try to not presume any knowledge of any cuneiform languages during the course of this presentation. Then Rune will take over a brief history of research segment on the discovery, decipherment and impact of cuneiform culture more broadly. And then I will introduce you a little bit on scholarly conventions with regards to cuneiform writing, so copying conventions, editing conventions, and so forth, both analog and digital ones, just to give you a background for our discussions of digital resources for studying cuneiform, which is going to be the major part of this presentation. So I will introduce you to some of the larger platforms. We are quite lucky in our field that there's actually lots of digital resources out there, and we'll just try to give you an overview of what there is and what one can actually use it for. So I'll give you a general overview and demonstrate a couple of the platforms that are available out there. Then Katie will take over and talk about Hittite. And then Rune will introduce you to the largest platform there is for cuneiform out there. That's the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, or CDLI. And that's also the platform that Rune and Émilie, who cannot be with us today, are affiliated with. And then we have, of course, the practical part and an exercise where you actually get to explore some of these platforms a little more thoroughly. So what do I mean when I talk about cuneiform writing? So cuneiform writing was invented plus minus 3400 BC. The chronology is a bit iffy there, and remained in use for more than 3000 years. until the 1st century CE. So this is quite a large span, but during the last few centuries there, it was already heavily dying out and being slowly replaced by alphabetic scripts. Cuneiform writing in itself is a logosyllabic system, so it consists of word signs and syllable signs. And it also has determinatives, both semantic determinatives and phonetic determinatives. So it uses specific signs to tell you how to read certain other signs. So for example, you use the sign for God to indicate that what follows is the name of a deity. So it's quite complicated. The cuneiform signs, most cuneiform signs at least, are also polyvalent. So each individual sign can actually be read in several different ways. So there's not just one specific meaning associated with each cuneiform character, but actually there's, depending on context, you can read the same sign in several different ways. And depending on context, you can also read it as a word sign or a syllable sign, respectively. At the same time, there's also several signs with the same phonetic value. So if you want to write the syllable she, for example, you can actually choose between different characters that all have the value she. So yeah, this is a rather complicated writing system, and we will get back to why this is relevant when we talk about things like digitization and machine reading and so forth. In addition to the kind of inherent complexities of the cuneiform writing system, it was also used to write at least 11 different languages. So it was adopted and adapted to a range of different languages from different language families. So the original language, the first language that used the cuneiform script and that the script was probably invented for, is Sumerian. It's the ancient language of southern Iraq in the 3rd millennium BCE. And Sumerian is a linguistic isolate and has a relatively simple syllable structure, so that worked quite nicely with the logosyllabic system. But then the language was adapted and adopted, most importantly, to Akkadian. So this is a Semitic language. It's mostly known from its main dialects, Babylonian in southern Iraq and Assyrian in northern Iraq. And so the language system was already adapted and then used for several thousand years to write Akkadian. There are other languages that are also written in cuneiform, including several Indo-European languages, such as, for example, Hittite, but also Old Persian, the language of the Achaemenid Empire, and a range of other less well documented languages. Most of our texts in cuneiform are written on clay, so on clay tablets that were held in the hand, and then the characters were imprinted with a stylus. So the writing system is inherently quite three-dimensional, and this is also something we'll come back to later. In addition to clay tablets, we also have other objects with cuneiform writing on it. So I've given you some examples on the slide. We have inscribed bricks, for example. So these are actually bricks that were used to build buildings, temples, and so forth. This particular one has animal footprints on it as well. But there's also inscriptions on other materials such as stone, metal, and so forth. You can see on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see an inscribed cylinder seal, which is kind of an identity marking device. And at the bottom, that's an inscribed clay cylinder of King Antiochus Soter. That's actually one of the latest royal inscriptions we have written in cuneiform writing. So mostly clay tablets, but quite a wide range of different materials. And we also have quite a wide range of genres used to write cuneiform. The vast majority of texts is administrative, so about, at least 70%, in some time periods a bit more, of the text that we have are receipts, accounts, ledgers, and so forth. But we also have quite large numbers of literary texts, of lexical texts, so word lists that were used to, for example, teach student scribes. We have royal inscription, public display inscription. We have letters. We have legal documents, for example, law codes, but also contracts, for example. So there's quite a variety of genres as well. Now, talking about how many texts, individual cuneiform items we actually have. So we have come up with an estimate of around 430,000 inscribed objects that can be associated with a known archaeological provenience. So that does not necessarily mean they come from controlled archaeological excavations, but there are objects that for some reason, either from secondary sources or from text internal criteria, can be associated with a specific archaeological site. And for about 430,000 texts, we can actually do that. And there's, of course, many additional texts where we cannot do that. So I think we are dealing with at least 500,000, but likely quite a bit more texts in cuneiform writing that have survived until this day. So where in the world are we? Where do the cuneiform inscriptions actually come from? And again, you can see this is quite a vast area over which the texts were found. This is, again, the distribution of these 430,000 texts from known archaeological sites. And yeah, they're divided. Yeah, it's about 600 archaeological sites that we can associate texts with. And you can see it stretches all the way from the west, from Falerii in Italy to southern Russia in the north, to southern Egypt in the south, and to the region around Kabul in Afghanistan in the east. Obviously, these objects from the kind of far extremities, yeah, they're not evidence that cuneiform writing was used in those regions, but they are scattered objects that were found there. But you can see on the map that there is quite a clear concentration of find spots around what we tend to call the Fertile Crescent. So the area kind of ranging from Iraq through northern Syria and down the Levantine coast. And there's also a few clusters in central Anatolia in Turkey. So the vast majority of our texts come from what is modern Iraq, but there's also sizable numbers of texts from Syria, Iran, Turkey, and so forth. So the majority of texts, about 90% of all cuneiform texts, are from those 4 countries, but there are scattered finds in about 20 countries more. Now I'll hand the word over to Rune.
Yeah. Okay. So I just want to add a bit of a commentary on the history of discovery and decipherment of cuneiform inscriptions, and also a few comments about the impact that the discovery of cuneiform had, first of all, in 19th century Western Europe and North America, but also how that sort of feeds into what cuneiformists are working with today. The discovery of cuneiform can actually be said to sort of go very far back, in the sense that inscriptions in cuneiform, at the point where cuneiform went out of use as not a spoken language, but as a script in use, dating from around 100 of the Common Era, is actually continues to be or appear in local folk traditions across the Middle East since antiquity. There are a number of examples of cuneiform inscriptions being venerated in various religious locations, something that you'll discover looking into the archaeological distributions you can find on the CDLI, for example. And even though the cuneiform script was not understood by later communities in the Middle East, it is still part of the cultural heritage of the Middle East that has a very central place in the understanding of the ancient history of the region. And that's something to bear in mind, because usually in most readers you'll find describing the history of the discovery and decipherment of cuneiform, it's not actually an aspect of the history of the script that receives much prominence. But the traditional story of how cuneiform came to be discovered and eventually deciphered usually begins with reports by Western travelers to the Middle East from around 1600 Common Era, but also before that time, where various individual pieces of cuneiform inscriptions make their way to cabinets or art cabinets in various places in Europe, or they are copied by travelers who then brings these copies back home to learner societies in Western Europe and later on in the US. This forms the basis for initial attempts at decipherment of cuneiform. Now, as Seraina has already mentioned, cuneiform is a rather complicated script to approach, and is also, of course, especially when it's being used for writing multiple different languages. But the first partial decipherments of cuneiform, which is that variety of the cuneiform script which we call Persian cuneiform, which is a rendition of Old Persian in cuneiform signs, is achieved around 1802 based on comparisons with the syntax and structure of later Persian royal inscriptions. So it's a very interesting history of decipherment and solving the script, in the sense that it is based on knowledge of later traditions of using writing for display inscriptions. But Persian cuneiform, rendering an alphabetic script on alphabetic set of signs, is relatively easy to go to, but the full decipherment of Akkadian only really takes place, or is achieved, in the 1830s, 40s, 50s. The common sort of date of agreement for when Babylonian or Babylonian Assyrian, which we call Akkadian, cuneiform is fully deciphered is 1857 through actually a competition written out by the Royal Asiatic Society in London, with the participation of 4 leading cuneiform specialists that then are assigned the same text and then asked to deliver a translation of that text. And the 4 translations come out more or less the same, and at that point it could be said that Babylonian cuneiform was finally deciphered. But this entire history of decipherment is based on a very limited amount of sources, relatively speaking. The first major archaeological discoveries of cuneiform sources from archaeological sites were only undertaken around the mid-19th century CE by the British and French. But by the late 19th century and into the early 20th century, we begin to see an explosive growth of the available corpus of cuneiform inscriptions through excavations taking place mainly in Iraq, but also elsewhere in the Middle East. That was a bit about the sort of history of decipherment, which is much more complex than I just explained here, and something I would encourage you to read more about because of the exciting history. Also, just to briefly mention the impact that the discovery of cuneiform, and really the discovery of ancient cultures in the Middle East, or the cuneiform world, had on contemporary Western Europe. The archaeological discoveries in the mid-19th century really were the first concrete evidence of cultures existing prior to the narratives laid down in the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible. And as such, when first being discovered, the Assyrian and Babylonian civilization, the remains of the Assyrian and Babylonian civilizations in northern Iraq and southern Iraq, brought about a significant and critical rethinking of the present-day Victorian worldview, which tended to view human history very much along the lines of Christian or Judeo-Christian religion. But the discoveries of these hitherto unknown cultures, illustrated here with an Assyrian colossal gate bull that's being brought into the British Museum, where you can still see them today, was something that forced people to question the biblical narrative, and also to begin to pursue the discovery of human history through textual sources much further back in time. And this, of course, eventually sort of laid the foundations for the work that cuneiformists are doing today, working both with this extremely diverse corpus of text. So, as Seraina already mentioned, we have genres both in terms of literary, scientific texts, poems, religious compositions, but also letters, diplomatic correspondences, royal treaties, architectural display inscriptions, and of course, a very, very large body of economic documentation can tell us a lot about what not everybody or average people in the cuneiform world, but a lot more people than what you'd gather from royal inscriptions were actually doing. It means that today, cuneiform studies or archaeology is both a discipline that is highly focused, of course, on epigraphy and study of linguistics, and study of language, and all the things that comes with the sort of current digital philology toolkit. But it's also very closely associated with archaeological research, because cuneiform texts ultimately all more or less come from archaeological excavations. And with that, I'll turn it back to Seraina.
Yes, thank you, Rune. And yes, I would here just like to briefly talk a little bit about workflows. So what archaeologists, as the people working with cuneiform texts, actually work with, how we make things accessible to scholarly audiences, but also to the wider public. And then I'll talk a little bit more about online databases and kind of digital tools of how to achieve this. And I'd like to start with one of the kind of maybe slightly unintuitive obstacles to making things available, publicly accessible online, and that is that lots and lots of museums don't really know what they have. So the museums themselves don't really have a good overview of their collections, especially larger museums with lots of cuneiform fragments. Again, lots of the objects can be in very fragmentary state. You can see a small fragment, for example, on the slide on the right-hand side. And several museums still work with paper ledgers of their cuneiform tablets and various other parts of their museum collections. In some cases, even handwritten ledgers. So part of making things available and digitizing things is also just to get an overview of what there actually is out there and what objects we are still missing access to. And this is also something we were doing when we sat down and started counting how many cuneiform texts we can actually document based on the scholarly literature. And that's when we came up with that number of 430,000 texts. But again, so some of the issues is that there's lots and lots of texts still hidden away in museum collections, or they're only registered in ledgers, but we don't have photos or pictures, and we don't really know what the texts are about. And again, especially in the case of extremely fragmentary texts, this can be quite challenging. So visual representations of the texts are not normally readily available. This is also in the, again, earlier days, the early heyday of archaeology. Photography was not well developed. So the way of making cuneiform texts actually accessible to other scholars and to the public was to go to museums and actually draw the tablets, like an archaeological artifact drawing, to actually create a facsimile drawing of the cuneiform tablet. And this has been, since the beginnings of archaeology, essentially one of the main approaches to making the text as an artifact available. And this is something we still do today. So this is not kind of a historical method. Part of why it's quite useful to have these drawings is also that, again, as I mentioned, cuneiform writing is quite a three-dimensional writing system. So the tablets themselves are usually a bit rounded. The characters, the cuneiform signs themselves are three-dimensional. So essentially, no matter where the light comes from, if you take one static photograph, you will never have a good view of all the characters on an individual tablet. And the nice thing is that if you draw it, you can kind of mitigate that by adding shading and by interpreting what you see on the physical tablet. That being said, these facsimile drawings are, to some degree, an interpretation. So you cannot really do a facsimile drawing of a cuneiform document if you cannot read what is written there. So of course, there's also a little bit of bias from the individual copyist that's actually coming to the fore in this content. But again, hand copies, drawings of tablets are still the most common way of publishing the tablets as artifacts. These days, we no longer draw them with paper. I think many of us draw them in Photoshop or Illustrators or other formats. But this is still a relatively inexpensive way of publishing the tablets. There are, of course, much nicer, better ways of representing things these days. So beyond just hand copying or static photographing tablets, there's now also, it's possible to use new tools such as RTI scanning with a dome or 3D scanning, using laser scan or photogrammetry, which of course gives you a wonderful artifact that you can look at from different angles, where you can change the shading of the lighting and so forth. And these are, of course, the perfect thing to work with as a scholar if you don't have access to the actual object. But these representations are quite work intensive. So it takes a lot of manpower to actually create these. They're also quite large files normally, so it also takes a fair bit of storage power. So for the time being, most people, I think, still work with hand copies and photographs. And yeah, we're very happy when we get the nicer representations, such as 3D representations. The problem, of course, with these hand copies and with the photographs is that they're absolutely not machine readable. They're very nice, faithful depictions of what actually is on the tablet, how the tablet looks in terms of shape and size and format and so forth. But to do anything more with the text itself, it is important to transfer it somehow into a writing system that is a bit more easy to process, both for human readers and for machines. And this is kind of the basic thing here. There are certain transliteration conventions, some specific to print publication, so for human readers, and some are specific to machine reading, to machine publication, but some of the conventions are also shared. There are, for example, certain things that we indicate logograms, word signs in a specific way in our transliteration or transcription, or that we differentiate between how the particular sign is actually read in a certain context. So we're not just giving the kind of standardized reading, but we're actually interpreting how because again, cuneiform signs have lots of different meanings. We actually, in our transliteration or transcription, we pick the specific meaning that the sign has in this particular context. So also there's a fair bit of interpretation involved in it. So there are certain formats to make the transliteration slightly more machine readable and processable. And there's particularly ATF, which is a format that was originally created for the Cuneiform Digital Library, the CDLI, that we will be talking about more later. And that, again, was a format that kind of takes the traditional Assyriological way of transliterating things, but makes it more easily machine readable, while still preserving some characteristics, such as, for example, the layout and lines and so forth of the texts. These have then been further developed, and we now have additional systems that can also encode things like just lemmatizing things, that can encode the morphology, the syntax, and so forth. So this has also been further developed in line with how increasingly computationalized Assyriology as a field has become. One more thing to mention, in addition to the hand copies, the drawings, and the transliteration, is that, of course, we also publish translations, and again, also in paper publications, but increasingly also online. And there's always a bit of a disconnect between scholarly translations that tend to be more literal, that tend to be line by line, and that are significantly less accessible to a general readership who's maybe not so familiar with Akkadian syntax, for example. So that's very often, as in some of the examples you can see on the slide, you have the line in Sumerian or Akkadian, and then you have the translation of the line, and then you have the next line, and you have a translation of the line. Which, of course, again, doesn't really lead to a very easily, nicely readable translated text. The alternative, of course, is to completely create a text, a modern translation that's completely disconnected from the ancient text, from the transliterations, and so forth, which can also be then difficult, especially for an audience that knows a bit more about the underlying structure. So there's a kind of a middle ground that, for example, the ORAC project uses, in that it groups its translations into paragraphs instead of lines. So it's not a completely full text where you cannot no longer see which part of the translation corresponds to which part of the original text, but it's also not a line-by-line translation. So it's kind of a nice compromise between those two. Often the translations are also based on composites of a composition, so not on an individual duplicate of a text, but kind of on a reconstructed urtext version of any given text, simply because you have to at some point make some choices. And that's particularly true when we talk about literary texts or royal inscriptions. And these composite texts, again, they essentially stem from the fact that we have, especially for Mesopotamian literature, and particularly for Sumerian literature, we have lots and lots and lots of duplicates of the same texts. So literary and lexical texts were copied in schools, in scribal education and the education of junior scribes. They copied in full, copied in part. So we have some compositions where we have dozens and dozens of duplicates. And very often we don't have a master text or kind of a correct copy of it, but all we have left are copies made by student scribes. And often they contain error, they contain inconsistencies and so forth. So it's sometimes very difficult to evaluate which part may be the correct or original version of the texts. So we don't normally create stemmas or anything like that from the texts, but we try to kind of, find a composite version from the different fragments that we have available, and to kind of create a feasible, workable alternative, which, while it is understood that this is not a real text that existed, but it's rather a reconstruction of an original text based on lots of different fragments that potentially have variants and inconsistencies. And again, translations of the text, especially ones available to the general public, tend to be based on these kind of reconstructions of composite texts. One more thing to mention before we move on to the digital tools available are seals. And this is an incredibly Mesopotamian genre of object. So cylinder seals, these round cylindrical objects, they were used as a type of identity marker to authenticate or authorize text. So they were rolled over the wet clay of a tablet. And we have them from essentially all time periods from ancient Mesopotamia. They're usually decorated in some form. They can be made out of quite precious materials, imported stones and so forth. And they are also very often inscribed. And because these cylinder seals were used so often, it happens very frequently that we have hundreds, even up to thousands of impressions of the same seal. And so again, here we have the issue, like with the composite texts, that we normally don't have the actual seal, the actual stone object that was rolled over the tablet preserved. But we have so many impressions of these seals on clay that we can actually reconstruct a kind of the original form of how the seal originally looked. So we organize this information in similar ways that we organized information from different texts. All right, so after all of this background, let's talk a little bit about digital resources for working with cuneiform. And again, we are here in a very, very lucky situation in that there is a lot available. And there's also been quite a lot of early projects that started relatively early on in the beginning of kind of digital humanities as a field that started making things available online and created tools that people can use. I've just grouped some of the resources that are available into three broad categories. And in this lesson today, we'll mostly be focusing on the first group. So the first group, there's a primary text repository. So these are online editions, collections of cuneiform texts, their structure, their data, their state of completeness, where they're from, when they date to, and so forth. So these are large platforms that actually make the texts available to the public, scholarly public and the wider public as well. And some of the largest that do this are the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative that Rune will be talking about later, the Open Richly Annotated Cuneiform Corpus, which is actually a platform with lots of smaller projects focused on different time periods, different genres, and so forth. The database of Neo-Sumerian texts, which is a database just focusing on one specific time period, the 21st century BCE, and so forth. So there are lots of these platforms. There's plenty more. Those are just some of the largest ones, where the texts are actually being made available. Some of them make them available in drawings and pictures. Some of them make them available in transliteration and translation and so forth. So there's different focuses, but it has been a very intense effort to make things available online for everyone to access. In addition to that, there's also some derived projects, so case studies, projects that are more kind of overarching. For example, the electronic Pennsylvania Sumerian Dictionary, which is an online dictionary, is actually the only full, complete dictionary we really have for the Sumerian language, and which is then again also interlinked with other electronic resources. I'm not going to demonstrate that in detail because I was assuming not that many people in the audience will be able to read Sumerian. And there's also things like the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, which is a very wonderful project that makes Sumerian literary texts available in transliteration and in translation. And then there's a range of additional initiatives that work with various things, from machine reading of cuneiform text, 3D imaging, spatial data, and so forth. So there's lots and lots of derived projects as well. But again, for today, we will just focus on the primary text repositories, so platforms that make texts available in some form. So this slide shows you a size distribution of the largest platforms. I think the data is a few years old, of the largest platform for cuneiform documents. And you can see the big blue blob in the middle. That's the CDLI, the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, which is the largest repository that we have to date. Then at the top, you can see this cluster of red dots. Those are a number of smaller projects that are clustered together on the ORAC platform that we will come back to in a minute. And then again, there's a range of other larger resources. For example, again, EBL, the Electronic Babylonian Library, BDTNS, the database of Neo-Sumerian texts, and so forth. So there's lots of smaller and larger resources, databases that focus on specific time periods, specific genres, and so forth. And only a few of them actually have for their goal to provide an overview of everything we have. One of the ones that has that goal is the CDLI. And so we shouldn't actually see at this bubble chart as bubbles next to each other, but of course there's a massive amount of overlap. So a lot of the texts that are included in these other databases are actually also in the CDLI, in the Cuneiform Digital Library, just in a slightly different format. So there's a fair bit of overlap between all of these platforms. There's actually more than on this slide, but they were created with very different goals in mind. Some focusing on prosopography, some focusing on certain genres like medicine, for example, some focusing on royal inscriptions, again, some like the Neo-Sumerian database focusing on specific time periods. So there's this quite a wide range of available resources. And I will show you some of the more important ones in a minute. So the largest platforms that we are dealing with, I've mentioned them before, they're the Cuneiform Digital Library, the ORAC, the Open Richly Annotated Cuneiform Corpus, and the Electronic Babylonian Library. And all of these projects have as a focus to make texts available. They have a slightly different focus in that CDLI in particular focused on making them available in photographs and hand copies and giving a lot of metadata, so provenience of the texts, genre, dating, and so forth. Whereas many of the ORAC projects and the EBL tend to provide transliterations, translations, also annotated texts. So there's a slightly different focus there. But all of these platforms also provide additional metadata. So yeah, I thought I'd just actually demonstrate what these platforms look like in practice. And I thought I'd start with ORAC. So ORAC is an acronym for the Open Richly Annotated Cuneiform Corpus. And essentially, it's just a large collection of different projects that focus on a range of different, different types of genres, of time periods, and so forth. You have, for example, a project dealing with astronomical diaries. You have a project dealing with Akkadian love literature. You have the Achaemenid royal inscriptions, and so forth. So there's a lengthy list of various projects, and I really encourage you to go and explore all of these projects. I'll just, as an example, I have already selected one, and that is the Royal Inscriptions of Assyria Online project, just for the sake of demonstration. And here again, if you go to the main page of the project, you get a lot of information about the project, background information on how the project came about, who was involved, who, additional literature and so forth. There's lots and lots of links and additional information on the left-hand side. And then you can also access the online corpus. So if you click on Browse Online Corpus, you get to a slightly old-fashioned looking page where you have an overview. And for this particular project, because these are the royal inscriptions of Assyria online, so maybe not so surprisingly, the texts are grouped according to the Assyrian king that they date to, which you can see here on the left-hand side. And I'll just choose Ashurbanipal because he's probably one of the most famous Neo-Assyrian kings, one of the last kings of Assyria. And then you get a list of all of his royal inscriptions with a number. And again, there's 318 of them. Name of the king, dating, which is Neo-Assyrian, and then where the text comes from. So most of them are from Nineveh, but there's a couple from other places like Kalhu and Nimrud. Kalhu, Nimrud, or Babylon. And then if we look at an individual text, for example, this one, we actually get an annotated transliteration of the text. And then alongside of it, we also get a translation. And again, this is a translation in paragraphs, in sort of larger segments. So it's not quite so disruptive as having line-by-line translations. What we don't have here is pictures of the texts or drawings that we would have to look up elsewhere. And we get a little bit of metadata that it is a prism and it's written in the middle of the 7th century. And then here in the transliteration side of it, we can, for example, hover over any kind of word that we find there, and then it tells us what word it comes from, in this case, Nibitu, which means naming or invocation. So these texts are also annotated. And again, you can get pages like that for almost all the projects in ORAC. So there's lots of text that can be explored. And again, in most cases, they are available also in translation. So if you're super interested in Neo-Assyrian royal inscriptions, you can still, even if you don't speak Akkadian, you can follow the text. We find a similar concept when we look at the EBL, the Electronic Babylonian Library. Just go to the main page. And here they actually have lots of useful tools and the bibliography and so forth. But for this purpose, we'll just look at the corpus. And here that gives us to the texts that they are currently dealing with, where we can choose between literary texts, divination, medicine, or magic. And then we get a list of different texts, different types of genres, subgenres of literary text, and we'll just choose the Babylonian Epic of Creation, Enuma Elish, as an example. And so we get an overview page with an introduction to the text and a lot of literature. And then it actually gives us all the manuscripts and the cuneiform or the Akkadian texts with the translation. So when we click on here, for example, this is the first part of the text, the first tablet, we get an edition. So this is a normalized composite version of the text. So this is also one of those texts where we have lots of different copies in Akkadian, and then we have a translation into English on the right-hand side. And then when we look down here, it actually gives us the text as it appears in all of the different duplicates that we have for this text. So in this case, we have quite a lot of duplicates, and it even tells us where they're from and so forth. So we can actually see how they reached their reconstructed texts that they are giving us. And then we can also, like with the ORAC corpora, we can also see click on the words, and it gives us the translation, and it shows us when it's attested and so forth. So again, this is also a very useful resource for people who cannot read Sumerian or Akkadian to access the texts. And then there's one more thing I would like to quickly show, and this is a totally different platform, but our nice colleagues in Helsinki have actually made lexical networks for all Akkadian language texts. So they have actually calculated proximity values for words. So which words co-occur with which other words in different Akkadian language texts. And what's really nice for our purpose is that, yes, you can access this, if you scroll down here, you can access it in Akkadian, but you can also access it in English. So you can actually search for the words in their English translation. And I'll just demonstrate this quickly. And we'll just take all texts written in Akkadian as an example. And again, it comes in English. Just for the edges. And so it shows it as a network graph, of all the words, the entire Akkadian vocabulary. Their data comes from ORAC, so it's not comprehensive, but it's based on all of these projects in the ORAC database. And then we can find a word here, for example, house, and then see which other words the word for house is connected to in Akkadian texts. So this is quite interesting because that can also be used by people who don't actually know any Akkadian. Also very nicely, because this is a web application for the Gephi software, which is a bit buggy usually. You can also download the file and then open it in a desktop version of Gephi. And then you can see again here what this word is connected to in different Akkadian texts. There's also a link where you can look at the Akkadian text in context, but that's probably more relevant if you actually can read Akkadian. Yeah, so I'll hand over the word to Katie and Resources for Hittite.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm going to very quickly show you some resources for a sort of a subset of cuneiform studies for Hittite specifically on the Hittitology portal Mainz, which is sort of the portal to all Hittitology resources online. It's been around since 2001, and it hosts things like digital editions of text, bibliographies, photo archives, and things like that. And most excitingly, since 2023, the TLH DIG, the Thesaurus Linguarum Hethitorum Digitalis, which is a digital repository for sort of searchable and annotated transliterations of cuneiform texts. So this is searchable by tablet number. So if you want to find a particular tablet, so you can put in the Cabo number. Here I'm looking for a particular myth. And it can bring you straight to that tablet and straight to a transliteration of the tablet if you know what to look up. Like ORAC, if you hover over the words, sometimes you can get some information about the words. Sometimes you can get a dictionary form or it parsed or things like that. But most of this is because it's quite new, it hasn't been validated yet. So it might give you more than one option or it might be wrong. You can also use this to search for particular things within Hittite texts. So for example, if you wanted to look up a word, or in this case, I want to look up the name Pagé-Perron. I think it's usually spelled like that, and I want to look up Pagé-Perron in Hittite prayers and hymns, so I can search for a particular subset of Hittite texts. Those assigned the catalogue numbers 371 to 389, which I know are hymns and prayers, and then I can search within those texts and find all of the times that this name occurs within a subset of texts. One of the other things that's hosted by the HPM is the concordance, and this was one of the two sort of motivations as well for the development of the portal. Basically, this database contains all the information that we have about all of the Hittite tablets ever excavated. Obviously, when this was done in a print format, this is very difficult to use, and also very quickly became outdated. So since I think 2003, this database has been available online. So you can look up any Hittite texts, by any of the information about a tablet, or by any of the information about a text. So if you want to search, for example, all of the manuscripts associated with a particular text, or if you wanted to search for all of the tablets in a particular museum collection, you can look here. So for example, a search that I did recently was trying to find within the British Museum, so everything with a fine number BM in this inventory box here, all of the cult inventory texts. My students will know why I did this if any of them are watching. So I can then select all of the tablets that have an inventory number with the British Museum and that are assigned to the cult inventory texts, and that will find those here. And then in the results, we get all the information about these tablets, so the inventory number, where they're published, the CTH number, what particular text they're assigned to, as well as information about find spots and dates. And if there are any sort of publications related to these tablets, they can be found here as well. And you can also click on the little page to get to the transliteration if it's in the TLH dig. You can also search, for example, for all of the manuscripts associated with a particular text. And I'm going to search for 321, which is the text of the Ilyanka myth, so the myth, a myth to do with a serpent. And here you can see these texts have even more information. Also, you can have further information about the find spot, further bibliography, and also here, if the photographs or the hand copies are available online, you can click on the little camera image and get to any photographs of the text. Or if there's a 3D by the camera, you can also see the 3D model, and there are some of these texts that even have 3D models. And the other sort of important thing that one of the ways to access is via the concordance are the editions of the texts hosted by the HPM. So these are a little bit different to the texts in the TLH dig that are just transliterations of a particular tablet. These include composite editions of particular texts, as Seraina was just talking about for some of the Akkadian texts. Here, these online editions have both a sort of composite text where we have a normalized Hittite line, and then underneath each all of the particular copies from different tablets, organized here in the partitura, organized by each syntactically, sort of, so by each clause, and then each clause within the text is also given a number, but you can also click on, for example, the letter that a particular manuscript has been assigned, and get the text within a particular tablet. And producing this sort of like online edition was one of the other sort of motivations for the development of the HPM as a resource. obviously, one of the things when you're working with these texts of which you have multiple copies, it's very useful to have a way to display both a sort of composite edition and all of the text next to each other, and at the same time also look at a particular tablet, a particular text. And it's perhaps one of the real advantages of this sort of digital tool for cuneiform studies is the possibility to look at a particular text from all these different viewpoints more easily, and in all these different formats more easily than you might find in a traditional paper edition. Okay, and I'm going to now, I think, hand back to Rune to talk about the CDLI.
I'm just going to briefly run us through the CDLI as an online resource, and also in order to give you some ideas about how to approach a database of this size if you're coming at it for the first time. Remember, Seraina said there were around 360. I think it's actually closer to 380,000 individual records in the CDLI database by now. So just to give you sort of a brief kind of overview of what the CDLI is. Now we've been talking about other databases, and also to give you some ideas about how to approach the exercises that we're going to be running through in a moment. The CDLI was launched in 2002. It's been going on for more than 20 years now in various guises. It's a general database of cuneiform inscriptions. It's more or less working as the canonical index and metadata catalog for all cuneiform inscriptions worldwide. And it's based on international cooperation between a number of different scholars and institutions, entirely open access, not for profit. And it's also crowdsourced in that users that are registered and want to use the CDLI database can edit and submit data on text themselves by approval by the editorial team. It's directed by 4 co-directors and then a pool of some 420 registered users that are contributing data to the CDLI. We had around 12,000, or yes, 12,000 edits submitted, which would cover many more texts if we could count them. In 2024, and around 200,000 visitors, and I think something like 2 million page views last year. Part of that was because the CDLI made it onto the Joe Rogan Experience, which is another story. There are many different components to the CDLI data model and web page, but I'm just going to run you through some of the principal indexes or data tables that sort of make up the overall catalog. The core of the CDLI, of course, is the catalog or index of cuneiform inscriptions themselves, or artifacts as we refer to them. Oops, I think there was just an Arabic title from Iraq from last week that got in here. Sorry about that. It says cuneiform texts if you're in doubt. The artifact landing pages you have here and the entire artifacts index contain those 380,000 records that we're talking about, and around half of these will have photographs, some of them will have drawings. Then, of course, there's a copious amount of catalog data on material type, artifact type, language, genre, dating, archaeological provenience, and so on. And then also a smaller number with transliterations and an even smaller number with translations into a variety of different languages. Oh, and by the way, all the information that you see in all of these pages can be downloaded freely in a number of different formats. So we'll get back to that in the exercise. Otherwise, don't hesitate to ask. You can go at the text or records in the CDLI from the artifacts landing page or the simple search, which we'll show you doing the exercises. But you can also approach it by, for example, going through the provenience index or the index of archaeological proveniences. As Seraina said before, there are around 600 archaeological locations where cuneiform has been found. All of these are in the CDLI. So if you know which area or which location you're looking at, you can go to that specific entry and then filter all of the text that are associated with that entry from there. The same thing if you want to go at it from museum collections. We have around 1,250 records of museum collections around the world registered that are linked to these 380,000 individual inscribed artifacts. So if you know which museum or collection you want to look at, you can also choose that specific collection from the collections index and then filter text from there. Lastly, there's also a very large bibliography that is associated with the artifacts and archaeological proveniences and the museum collections by now. It counts around 20,000 records. This is all bibliographical data that can also be downloaded to your reference manager of choice. And of course, linked to author records, editors' records, journal records, and also have links to online free or freely accessible versions of the actual publication if such exist. So this is just to give you an idea of the many different angles from which you can actually come at the individual or selection of cuneiform artifacts in the CDLI database. Lastly, the CDLI also works as a online hub to other resources. So Seraina already explained that there's a lot of different cuneiform databases with various scopes, focus areas, and contents out there. The CDLI, being sort of the canonical index, is also maintaining a very large record of external links, also the external resource links to the matching record of a specific artifact, for example, in other databases. Right now, we're linking to around 200 external databases with around 400,000 or more external links. That's 400,000 links from one cuneiform inscriptions to its matching record in another database. So it can also be used to access other versions or renditions of the same artifact in other repositories online. That was a very quick summary of the CDLI that we're going to be looking at for the exercises, which I'm going to turn over to Seraina for continuing.
Sorry. Yes. Yeah, so for the exercises, we would like you to kind of explore a little bit these platforms that we've been talking about, and especially the platform of the CDLI. And to start you off, we thought we'd just let you search for things in various ways. So there's we suggest 4 different ways of trying to find some results. So you can just use the standard search function on the main CDLI page. So you can, which is just, if you open the page, there is a search field that says search. And yeah, you can, for example, search for the word stone, and then you get all the artifacts that are made out of stone. You might also get artifacts associated with an author named Stone if you are just searching for in the free search. So in that case, if you just want the stone artifacts, you may have to use the advanced search. But just yeah, try different search terms and play with that. Then again, as Rune has just mentioned, you can also access the artifacts via the museums, via the collections index. So you can also go onto the collections page, and again, the link is on the slide and in the introduction, in the instructions, and you can search for specific museum collections. So again, we suggest one that you can try, but feel free to search for any museum that you would like to search for, and then you get the results, and then you can click on the link that says related artifacts, and you then get all the objects in the CDLI database that are linked to this particular museum. The same goes through for the regions index. So the archaeological sites that are proveniences in the CDLI are linked to larger regions. And so you can go to the regions index, pick any region you would like, and then it gives you a list of all the proveniences in that particular region. And then again, you can choose that one. And if you click on related artifacts, you get all the artifacts from that provenience. And then you can also do that again from the publications, so that bibliographical database that Rune was just talking about. So you can search for example, for an author name, for example, for Molina, and then select one of the publications. And then you get a list of all the artifacts that are associated with this particular publication. So yeah, we would just like you to start by playing around with the search function, trying to filter, find things, and so forth. Once you have a nice search result that you find interesting, we would like you to download the catalog data. So ideally, For the download, try to reduce your corpus down to something below 1,000 entries, simply for the sake of kind of keeping the server load a bit limited. But so when you get your search result, you have on the top left, you find a button that actually says download data. And then you can download different ways. You can download the metadata, so the catalog data. You can also download the transliterations in various formats and so forth, which is maybe not so relevant in this particular context. But yeah, so just try to download the metadata or the catalog data and then open it in your preferred application for working with tabular data. So Excel, OpenRefine, or whatever you are working with. And just as a side note here, when you use that download button, it only downloads the search results on the page that you are on. And it normally defaults to 25 search results per page. So you have to make sure that the page actually displays all of your results before you download it. Otherwise, you have to download it in small increments, which is also not the end of the world because this is an exercise. And then once you have this in some form of tabular format, yeah, actually look at your data. First, look at that data set that you got out of CDLI and try to find out what it actually is that this data set is showing you. What types of categories do you have? What kind of metadata do you find there? Just to give yourself a bit of an overview, there may be lots of fields that are not relevant for you at all that you can delete. And then, as a second task, try to somehow visualize the data set that you downloaded by cross-referencing, at least 2 types of entities, so metadata variables. For example, visualize provenience and period, so how many texts are from a certain site in any given period, or provenience and material, how many stone objects from any given site, material and object type and genre, and so on. To just play around a little bit, depending on what your search terms were. Not all of these combinations will make a lot of sense. So it's a bit of a trial and error thing. And you can do this in any way you like, depending on how experienced you are with creating visualizations. You can just make a simple chart in Excel. That's totally fine. Some kind of graph. You can do it in R if you'd like, or if you can make maps, you can create a map if you want of your search results. For the maps, the CDLI download doesn't give you the geodata, so you need the geographical placement of the sites that are your provenience. And for that, you can actually get that from the Cuneiform Inscriptions Geographical Site Index 6. Either Google that, or it's also linked in the resources on the resources page. And there you get the geographical coordinates for all of the sites where cuneiform texts have been found. So if you want to make a map, you can also do that. And then for a last and optional step, we would like you to move beyond the CDLI and maybe try producing a visualization from something else. For example, from looking at the ORAC data, trying to look at social network data, linguistic network data, like the one I showed you earlier, or various other data sets. Essentially, just play around a little bit with all the resources. You can also use the Hittite resources, for example. Just have a look at what's there, try to get a feel for it, and also what you can do with the data that is available. Rune, do you want to quickly demonstrate that on the CDLI page?
Yes, I'd be happy to. If you remind me which directions I'm going in, because I don't have a second screen I can look at here.
Sure.
If we go to back to the landing page, just for the first standard exercise, let's see, where am I? I am here. That's the one I'm sharing. Yes. Okay, so if we go for the standard search function, here's the CDLR landing page, and just go straight from the simple search field. Here, I can just type in stone, as Seraina suggested, we suggested in the exercise text. Press search, And one great thing about the CDLI is that considering that it has 380,000 records, the search results usually come back magnificently fast. And then you'll be handed, well, in this case, plus 10,000 records. You can usually scroll down to the bottom at the end of the first 25 records to get an idea of just how much you've picked up. Here it said 10,000 total, which is the normal for a full search. If you want over 10,000, you might have to go to the API. And then just to give you, this is jumping on to step 2, but if you want to download the search results data, I'm not going to do it here, as Seraina said, at the top left corner of the search results interface, you have the export button here, where you can then see the various formats that you can download data in, the metadata catalog, text annotations, or you can download all of the associated publications that are associated with the search results that you have here in a CSV or BibTeX format if you want to. For now, we just recommend that you go for the flat catalog data in CSV, which should work with any tabular data software that you're working with. That was the first. Then let's go back to the landing page again. And then going for browse is one way of accessing the other indexes that I was showing earlier on. So the first one was the collections index. Which is here, one of the pinned values. And then I'll get to the landing page for the collections table, collections index, where we'll first have a couple of pinned examples, but down here you'll have the search function, where you can search for all of the collections on any string, a part of a string. So if I go for the archive, the suggestion was, and press search, I'll then be given the record for the Diaker collection at Netherlands Institute for the Near East in Leiden. I can click that. And here we have one of the collection records I was showing you earlier on, where you would have the basic information that we have on the museum collection specifically. But if you go to related artifacts, you can go this way, and then you'll get back to the search page, but now with the search results already returned of all of the texts that are linked to the Diaker collection in Leiden. And then, of course, we can go back to downloading the data in the same way as we just did for the simple search. Then we got to the regions index, which, as Seraina said, is a kind of an overarching index for archaeological proveniences. So dividing those 600 different archaeological locations into a smaller group of overarching geographical regions. That comes with a map here. We're still working on the shapefile, but you can then scroll further down and then get the record for the individual ones. And then I just go and choose, let's see where I want to go. Eastern Arabia. There. Then it will give me the overview. And then also the archaeological sites associated with that place. So I go to Dilmun here, and then we land at a provenience record. And just with the collection record before for the Diaker collection at Leiden, then for this archaeological site, Dilmun, or ancient Dilmun, modern Kala al-Bahrain on the Bahrain island, I can then go to the related artifacts. And we return to the search results page that will be listing all of the related artifacts to that archaeological site. And again, we can go and download that data. So you see, that's all a way of using the different controlled indexes that sort of structure or add additional to the metadata catalog of the CDLI, also to search or filter out data from certain areas. Of course, I could have done the same if we just referred all the texts in a region, then also return the results for that. Finally, let's just head over to the publications table, which is a bit different. This can also be accessed from the bibliography icon out here on the landing page. My network is a bit slow. Okay. Sorry about that. If you're already busy doing a lot of downloads, then I can understand that the web page might just be a bit slow, but normally it doesn't behave like this.
I think we may have crashed it, but
Just give me a moment.
Well, people will also figure it out, and it's good for them to try something on their own.
No, I think I got it now. Just a moment. Yes, now it's there. So here you have the landing page for the publications table. And then we can do the same again, suggesting a search for Molina just in the BibTeX key. You can also search for the author name, the publisher, the author designation, the journal if you want to. Or you can make a search by a year range, for example. But if we just try the initial name that was suggested, which is the surname of a very well-known archaeologist running the database of Sumerian texts, and then scroll down to his 2005 publication. This one. Then we go to the actual record for this specific publication in the CDLI bibliography. And just with proveniences and collections, we can do the same. Go to related artifacts that are listed below. So this lists all the artifacts in the artifacts index of the CDLI that are linked to this specific publication, either because it's the primary publication for these artifacts or because the artifacts are mentioned in that publication for some other reason. There can be many different kinds of links. And then we can go to full search results. And we're back again at the search landing page and can now export all of the metadata on the artifacts that are associated with this specific publication. Okay, so those were the various steps of the first part of the exercise. If we just briefly look at the second part, the download catalog data, as I said, you can go to the export button here and then just go for, if you go for the flat catalog data, then press the CSV link, and then it will download the CSV format, all that you have here. But again, remember that if the number of search results that you've received exceeds 25, you will first need to scroll down to the bottom and make sure that you get all of the search results in the same page. Otherwise, it would only download the first 25, and then you are free to figure out how you get the rest of them. So now it should all be there. I go and press CSV. And then that should mean that I have the catalog data in my downloads folder in just a moment, as long as the page doesn't crash again. I think that covers it, Seraina.
Yes, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, and maybe just one more thing to say. If you have any questions, you would like more information, if you're interested in learning more about the CDLI or cuneiform or digital cuneiform in general, feel free to get in touch with any of us.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. If anybody is watching live, feel free to ask questions now. Post questions in chat. I know there's a relatively small number of people watching live. I suspect we'll have 100 people watching asynchronously on YouTube over the next 2 weeks. But yes, I found this very very exciting. I mean, my first thought in terms of the sort of fourth part of the exercise, the go away and play part, was that so our students, the students that Katie and I are teaching in London this week, have just done a couple of sessions on various aspects of text analysis. One of which was putting texts into Voyant and getting various views of the text in there. And it occurs to me that at the beginning of the semester, Katie, you told us that if you were going to put cuneiform text there, you had to do some pre-processing, such as replacing hyphens with underscores or something. Maybe you could tell us more about that. But it also occurs to me that if I were to do this with a text where I don't understand any of the words, I might struggle a little bit to make any interesting observations in the patterns in there. But I wonder if anyone has any thoughts for what you might do, what sort of patterns you might find in there, even if you don't necessarily know what all the words are, or are there some words that are interesting and common enough that we could be sort of looking out for them in advance, or I don't know, any thoughts?
So on putting cuneiform text into Voyant and things like that. As you'll see from the text that I'm about to put back on here, if you have a text that's just transliterated, that's not normalized, generally you have signs separated by a dash or sometimes by a dot. And if you put things into, for example, Voyant, it I think tends to see the dash and the dot as a word separator. So rather than considering, for example, ma, an as a whole word as it is, Voyant is likely to read that as 3 separate words, I think, ma, an. So then, you can visualize what signs are more common in a text quite easily. You might need to check what character you could replace, for example, the dashes and the dots with, that Voyant wouldn't then use to divide up the words into separate words before you do that. So that's sort of one complication with the transliterations not always being machine readable by things that weren't necessarily designed for working with cuneiform text. So if you did want to download some transliterations, you'd have to check how the tools you were using were interpreting the things like the dashes, for example. To answer that question, in terms of if you were looking through the text to sort of looking for stuff to look for and analyze, not in terms of the metadata but the text itself, if you didn't know very much about a text but wanted to search for things, one thing that's common to many cuneiform languages is using determinatives to tell you what sort of a word is, for example. So in this text you can see, for example, the little lowercase d here, and usually these determinatives are written superscript. The dingir indicates that the thing that follows is a divine name, but also uru, which means city, is a determinative for a place name. So, for example, if you wanted to, look and see what you could do with finding place names within an Akkadian or a Hittite text, for example, you could look for all of the things that were marked with the determinative uru within a text, and that might tell you something about, the number of different places that are mentioned, how many times they're mentioned, even if you didn't know, anything about the sentences that these place names were in. You might still find out something from the text just by looking for all of the place names within a text, for example. So that would be my suggestion, but there might be other ideas as well.
It's not so much an idea as just going back to what Seraina was talking about earlier on with digital resources. It's part of why it's important to understand which digital repositories you're tapping into when doing these kind of exercises, because naturally in one database, such as the CDLI, you won't have as many or as complete translations, you could say, as you have, for example, in the many ORAC projects that Seraina was showing, which have very extensive and very good and annotated English translations. But the problem there is that if you are looking to, say, look at frequencies of words being used in administrative documents, which are around 85–90% of the cuneiform corpus, you're not going to find those documents in ORAC projects. They tend to concern themselves primarily with literary and royal and epic compositions. So we say that the sort of the more elite part of the corpus. So it's always about sort of getting an idea of what part of the corpus you're looking at from these individuals' repositories before diving into the kind of questions you can ask from them.
The other thing that occurred to me, and this is slightly sort of out of sequence, as it were, for people who are doing an exercise this weekend, but is that next week, and indeed the week after, we will have sessions which will mention and show translation alignment tools, such as the appropriately named Ugarit translation alignment tool, which is another thing that you might want to take some of these texts if you have texts both in original languages and in English and indeed German or other translations. And one of the things that people do with these tools is they put up a text in a language they don't know and a text in a language they do, and see what, just by aligning them, see what sort of understanding they can gain of that language. Understanding whether or not there are some words are post positives, whether or not there are articles, those sorts of things. And so that could be an interesting experiment to do with these texts in one sense. And just a sort of warning that the Ugarit alignment tool will also attempt to tokenize your texts for you on punctuation. So there'll be an issue to deal with there as you work with them.
No, and I think one of the other sort of great things that I want to point out about the CDLI is because it has, so many texts in it. It's really sort of incredible what a view you can get of a very zoomed out view of what cuneiform texts are like, even just by sort of looking through the metadata categories and things like that. So if you're not familiar with cuneiform texts, or even things like the different genres of text that you might find, all of the different languages that are in the CDLI, do you look through very carefully all of the categories in the search functions, just to see what there is there, and what sort of things you can find, because even if not all the texts in the CDLI yet have the transliteration, it's great that there is the metadata there for them, and there's really a lot that you can learn just from the metadata as well.
And just to add to what Kathy is saying, you can also make use of the external resource links that the CDLI holds for individual text. So if you find things of interest, because again, the CDLI's primary quality is that it's a gigantic metadata catalog and reference index that are linking out to other pages that where people have had the time to actually make more of an effort to illuminate the historical and the linguistic, philological and archaeological context of individual texts or assemblages of text or genres or types of text. So you can also use the CLI's external resource links to actually go to, for example, ORAC pages or ORAC projects, which have a lot of very easily accessible information about royal inscriptions or love letters or religious poetry or something like that, and read more about the historical background of texts there. So you could also think of the CDLI as essentially this gigantic gateway to reaching other parts of the Cuneiform online ecosystem, so to say.
Yes, excellent. And that might also indeed lead to chunks of text that you might want to download, copy and paste. I mean, digital research doesn't have to be at massive scales. You can have a 10-line text and do digital things with it. So yeah, which of course, if you're a smallish text, then you can hand craft, you know, the way that punctuation is going to be treated by your tools, etc. I think a lot of these same questions that we're talking about now will come up again in 2 weeks' time in the session on working with Egyptian texts, because again, people will be thinking about, you know, what do you do with texts that are transliterated in different ways, that are you know, you might want to work with them, you might want to work with the metadata, you might want to work with the text itself, even if you're not an expert in that language, and so forth. And indeed, you know, a lot of the people who follow the Osmosis sessions are not necessarily experts in Greek or Latin either. So some of the texts that we talked about in some of the earlier sessions, you know, people are also, you know, running through something like Voyant or whatever, and seeing the most common words, but not necessarily being able to read them. So it's a fun exercise. Cool. So we more or less have come to time. Does anyone have any last sort of comments or observations to make?
Not except saying thank you for having us here.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Yes. No, this was wonderful. I've been very excited with this. I've got nine tabs open with different Cuneiform databases and looking for all the different magical texts that each one can offer me. So cool. Can't read any of them, but it's fun. Yeah, cool, fantastic. Thank you both very much. All very much indeed. Cheers.
Thank you.